It's not your business. What are you gonna do?
All right.
I'm
Let's
so
see,
upset.
that's just a little bit.
I'm actually physically upset.
There we go. Let's see if that's better. Easy. Yeah, a little bit better. Okay. All right. So we stopped talking about subjectivism according to my notes last time. The belief that we can't come up with any a priori rules because ethics seems to be unlike math. It seems to be without proofs. Now the problem with that is, of course, I said we couldn't have any, laws if we came up with that idea. We can develop laws and rules and regulations. So obviously, subjectivism is not based on rationale. I think you can offer good reasons for ethical behavior, and that is in a way a proof. If you can use logic and critical thinking to argue from premise to premise to premise to conclusion, and there's a nexus between them, and it's based on rational thought, you can develop these. Now, another one that's a challenge to ethics. This one is really popular by business, or used by business to justify all kinds of things. Is cultural relativism, and where you see this, I think I told you all last time when we talked about the international buyer. In here, can we talk about that? The company that I was a consultant for, I'm a lawyer, so people I used to have a client. Did we talk about this? All right, so I must have talked about it in my ethics class, which was right before this class. And since we're talking about ethics, I get confused which story. So if I start telling you the same story, you gotta like stop me and say, "We've heard that story already." Even though redundancy is good. So I had this client that wanted to hire an international buyer. They supply all kinds of electronic stuff, and they buy a lot of these electronic things from, where would you guess? Where do you get supplies of electronics, things like monster cables and stuff like that? Where do you think those come from? What? What'd you say? China. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the $10 million answer of the day. They come from China. In fact, seeing it class, I'll give you bonus points for taking the initiative there. That's one of the ways you can win bonus points is by talking to you. So they had a position for an international buyer. The requirements of the position were that you had to speak Mandarin, which is the dominant language in China. I guess there are different dialects. Every region has a dialect, but everybody learns Mandarin, according to them, and both according to our newest marketing professor, Wen-Kai Zhao, who is from China. So you had to speak Mandarin. You had to have an MBA degree, and they wanted you to have 7 years experience in buying, being a professional buyer. And one of the things, by the way, that we require if you get the professional sales degree is you have to take purchasing, because that's the other side of the transaction. It's understanding that other half, what it is that it is to work in a buying center, and what kinds of things that they look at, and how to understand the psychology of that is important. So we require that you take purchasing in this class. It's one of the least favorite classes that sales students have, because it's kind of boring and dry and dull. It's not fun like the sales classes where you get to engage in role play and things like that. So the reason they called me was they said, we have a candidate who meets all of these requirements. Very, very few people meet these requirements, right, at Diploma, because we just don't have a lot of people. Purchasing degrees are not abundant. MBAs are less abundant. 7 years in purchasing, that's not. And then to speak Chinese, it's a very limited pool. And they said, we have the most qualified candidate is a female, and we don't want to hire her. And I said, why don't you want to hire her? And this sounds like the ideal candidate. And they said, look, culturally, Chinese businessmen do not view women the same way American businessmen do, and they won't negotiate with her on a level playing field, and so it will affect our business. And further, it's customary in China, I don't know that this is true, but this is what they told me at the time, for them to go out and socialize after a deal, and they go to karaoke bars, which are really fronts for prostitution.
Oh.
And I don't know if that's true or not. That's what they said, and we don't want to subject a woman to that. And they said, can we not hire this person? I said, I don't think that that's legitimate, right? I mean, she meets the qualifications. That's not a valid reason to not hire her. And they said, well, we know that there's something they've gotten online, and Dr. Google can be a bad thing at times. You get on Google. How many of you have done this when you have some kind of illness, and before you're finished, you're convinced that you have SARS or MRSA or Ebola or something like that, and attorney Google can be equally as dangerous. So they said, we know that there's something called a Bfoq that allows you to discriminate in hiring if you have a legitimate business reason. This stands for bona fide occupational qualification. And isn't this a Bfoq? And I said, nope, not a Bfoq. The cases are very specific in this area about what constitutes a Bfoq. There are two types of discrimination that you can have in employment, and that may be legitimate for a Bfoq. The two types of discrimination that you can have are discrimination that's overt, right? So you can have overt discrimination, which is we just say we're only hiring females for this role, or we're only hiring males for this role. Right? And then you can have something that's called a disparate impact. Discrimination. What's an example of an overt? We're going to say we're only hiring females. Well, how many of you watched Saturday Night Live last week?
Who was the host?
Who was the host?
Yeah.
Who was
I
that?
remember.
Nobody watches Saturday Night Live.
Was it JJ?
Maybe there's a RuPaul was the host. Right? Wasn't it RuPaul was the host last week? Who's RuPaul? Anybody know?
The drag queen.
Yeah, he's like the 7 foot tall drag queen. And when he's dressed in drag, he looks like, I mean, other than the fact that he's freakishly tall, he looks like a female. Nobody would legitimately say that Warner Brothers has to hire a male to play a female role, even if they can dress in drag and look. I mean, that you can say, look, this is a romantic comedy. We're not hiring even the prettiest drag queen. It's a female part. It's a romantic comedy. The leading male is not going to want to, have kissy scenes with a drag queen. Right? Not going to happen. And the law says that's okay. Right? The law says, yeah, we understand that. Nobody would legitimately say that you have to let the drag queen be a exotic dancer at night trips. Okay. That's a legitimate. Which, by the way, if you want to go to work, if you want to sue, you want sort of an instant money, go apply to be a waiter or a server at Hooters, and if you're a male. Because Hooters refuses to say that they are an adult entertainment venue, they get sued all the time by people who want to be waiters or servers that are men, and they just pay them off. They'll, what will it take to get you to go away, right? Because they only hire women.
Yeah, it's
One time I wish I was
it goes at once.
Literally.
So that's overt. Disparate impact, which this was not what they wanted to do, was an overt discriminatory act. They just didn't want to hire a female for this job. Disparate impact occurs where you have what appears to be an objectively reasonable requirement that has a disparate impact on a population. So, for example, if you want to be a prison guard in Oklahoma, and I have a friend who did this, she's a female, in a male population, you have to be able to drag a 195-pound dummy the length of a gym floor. Now, how many women can do that? Not many. But that is an objective standard that has a disparate impact on women. That is a legitimate BFOQ because part of a prison guard's job is to do what?
Take care of the prison.
You may be called upon to,
Pick a fight.
break up a fight and drag a prisoner back to their cell. Right? I mean, this is not, and you may be the only one. So this is a legitimate. So that has a disparate impact. And I said, look, you don't fall within the exceptions. I mean, if you look, the case law just doesn't say that this is a BFOQ for you. And I'll give you a prime example of why it's not a BFOQ. Southwest Airlines started out as being a regional airline that flew for Texas businessmen. They started out in Texas. They only flew between Austin, Houston, and Dallas. And they were the love airline. Their symbol to this day is a heart on their airplane. And they did not want to hire male flight attendants, which what we used to call when I was growing up stewardesses, right? And this was not uncommon. In fact, there was a TV show called Pan Am about this, about Pan American Airways. And in order to be a stewardess, you had to be a certain height, you had to be under a certain age, and you had to be pretty, and they weighed you. They had a scale before every flight, and if you were a little bit too chunky, you were not going, right? And that's just the way it was. And Southwest didn't want to hire male flight attendants. And they said, look, our customers are all male oil businessmen. That's Texan and Oklahoma for oil business. Sounds like AWLBIDDNESS. I have a whole Oklahoma to English dictionary, by the way. All business. What? Oh, I've got a whole whole list of things. Like I had a judge tell me one time here in Oklahoma that the epitome of my case seemed to be epitome. What? He's like, epitome, E-P-I-T-O-M-E. Are you in it? No. Not so sure that you aren't, but that's pronounced epitome in normal places, not epitome.
You said that.
Yeah, epitome. Fiancé, that is Oklahoma for fiance. So I have the whole Oklahoma to English dictionary. So Southwest said, our customers want to be served by attractive women. And the court says, no, that's not a legitimate business reason. What is the primary purpose of a flight attendant? They're actually required by law to have them. And I bet you think that the primary purpose of the flight attendant is to give you a drink and throw peanuts at you or whatever it is that they're serving these days. When I first started flying as a little kid years and years ago in the 1980s, they actually served full meals on planes. They don't do that anymore unless you're in first class. But they actually, even in coach, they would serve, like there's a whole dish called airline chicken, which is what they serve, right? So the court says that's not the primary purpose. That's what they spend 90% of their time doing, right? Is giving you a drink and passing out peanuts. But the purpose of a flight attendant is for safety. They're there to provide the briefing. That's their primary function, is to provide safety. To give you the briefing, to open the emergency door and activate the slide in the case of a water landing or whatever, that's what they're there to do. Their purpose is not to make businessmen in Texas feel comfortable, and Southwest lost that case. And I said, you're the same boat. It's not a BFOQ, right? But this, according to a lot of businesses, this cultural relativism is necessary. If we have something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States, which prohibits you from bribing officials in other countries, and American businessmen will argue that this is a burden on them because other countries allow their businessmen to do this. This is very typical. Again, I'm told that in China, I don't know, I've never been there. It's not someplace that I have a great desire to go, but I've been told that bribery runs rampant. If you want to get something done, you bribe somebody to get it done. We can't do that. The cultural relativists, and this seems intuitively attractive because, again, we vary widely. In the United States, bribing officials has long since been outlawed. It is not permissible, and we recognize that. One of the things that we can say about cultural relativism is, again, it's not based on reason, but it allows for exceptionalism. It allows you to say, my culture, my society is special or unique. But one of the problems is that I would venture to guess that in those societies that bribery and corruption run rampant, although it may be tolerated, there is a difference between toleration and moral acceptance. I would be willing to bet that if you ask most people in China, they would say, I hate the system. It's unfair. I don't like it. Right? Women in oppressed societies, I would be willing to bet, would say, like, I don't like this. I want the ability to control my own destiny. The third challenge to philosophical ethics is the most difficult to deal with. This is called psychological egoism. Now, the other two sound right. This one doesn't sound right, but it's actually the most difficult for us to dispense with. Psychological egoism is what we call a deterministic theory. In that it says we are predetermined how we will behave. Either as a result of nature, nurture, or a combination of the two, we cannot help but behave in very predictable ways. And there's a guy named Martin Lindstrom who has written a book I've talked about before called Biology, B-U-I-O-L-O-G-Y, The Science of Why We Buy. And he says that that you will buy things and react to stimuli based on pleasure principles of the brain. They do these experiments where, and we actually had one of these machines at New Mexico State, a functional MRI machine, an fMRI machine, where we would put people in this machine. I didn't do this for my dissertation, but I had one of my colleagues who did this. They put people on this machine and they watch as they're shown marketing stimuli, what parts of the brain are firing. And although they may not in a survey, so Lindstrom talks about, for example, a survey that they did on television shows to determine which show would be successful. And people said that they didn't like, so one of the shows that they tested, I believe, if I recall correctly from the book, one of the shows that they tested was something called How Clean Is Your House? And it's sort of like a show along the line of Hoarders. How many of you have watched Hoarders? All of you have watched Hoarders. Why do you watch this show?
Very easy with the
Oh. Yeah. When they ask people about shows like that, they say, I'm not interested in that. On surveys, they'll say things like that. That doesn't really interest me. And this one, How Clean Is Your House? So they go into people's houses that are like, hoarders, or they're just horribly dirty. And, they clean up the house, clean up the cat poop and all of the things that people have. And people said on these surveys that they didn't want to watch that. And yet when they showed them the show in the fMRI machine, the part of the brain that was triggering was the pleasure part of the brain. So people will tell surveyors that they don't like these things because although you all admitted that you all have watched Hoarders, most people, that's not a socially acceptable response necessarily. Of course, your generation doesn't see things the same way because you're more open about these kinds of things than previous generations. My parents' generation, they're baby boomers. They're very sort of pathetically, that generation was what I refer to as pathetically middle class. Middle class morality ruled the day, which is you don't say mean things or unkind things about people. But the reason that people like these shows, I hypothesize based on this fact that the pleasure part of the brain is firing, is because no matter how bad your life is, you watch a show like that and you think, I'm better than that. Like, you know, I'm better than them. Right? And so psychological egoists will say, look, we can't help but behave the way we behave. Now, you all think that you have free will. But for a psychological egoist, that's illusory. Let's try an experiment. The biologists are going to be horrified at my simplification of genetics. What is a Homo sapien female genetically in terms of the chromosomes that she has? XX, right? I think that's right. Is that right? XX? What is a male? XY. Okay. So everyone who has a Y chromosome in the room, I want you to hold up your hand. If you have a Y chromosome, hold up your hand. Now, why did you do that? You think you have free will, but every male in this room held up their hand. Why?
Yeah.
Because I asked you to, your talk from an early age, do what the teacher says. If you didn't hold up your hand, your colleague might look at you, I'm not sure, questioning, right? By the way, again, with your generation, that joke seems to have less impact. In previous generations, people would laugh nervously. But, you know, we become so accustomed to, in the age of Caitlyn Jenner, to people, you know, saying I may not be a male or a female or whatever. So, you all held up your hand, you responded, well, so psychological egoists say, look, we can't really help doing what we do. Let's think about this. Can you will yourself to not want what you want? How many of you like shoes? I love shoes, right? Like I have lots of Allen Edmonds shoes, love shoes. Can you will yourself to not want shoes? You're saying no. Everybody says, like when I ask this question, most people say, yes, I can will myself. No, you cannot will yourself necessarily to not want the shoes. You may not buy the shoes, but that's not a result of wanting or not wanting the shoes. It just means that you wanted something else more than the shoes, but you didn't will yourself to want that either. I would have thousands of pairs of shoes if I could, but I don't. I have a lot of shoes, but I don't have thousands of pairs of them. Why? Because I want the money in my bank account. You know, I want to be able to make my house payment more than I want 1,000 pairs of shoes. Unlike Imelda Marcos, so it's like 2,500 pairs of shoes. You all don't remember who Imelda Marcos is. She was the wife. She was the first lady of the Philippines at one point in time. Her husband was a brutal dictator, and while people were starving to death, she had something like 2,500 pair of very expensive designer shoes. Right? So, but I didn't want that either. Well, what's wrong with this? Well, psychological egoists say that people always act in their own self-interest. And anytime that we start saying people always do this or they always do that, it's automatically suspect because the realm of human experience is such that it's not really possible to say we always do this. When we look at the fMRI technology, that tells us what part of the brain is functioning, but it doesn't tell us what people are actually thinking, right? And it conflates, psychological egoism conflates motivation with emotion. So psychological egoism would say, for example, there's no real such thing as altruism. People are really acting in their own self-interest. So, you know, we'll take the case of the late Mother Teresa, who spent her entire life helping the poorest and sickest among us. And psychological egos would say, well, she's just doing what she wants to do. She gets good feelings from that. Maybe God inspired her and told her to do these things. Well, the fact that she gets good feelings is not the same thing. It's a logical fallacy of equivocation in that the feelings are not necessarily the motivation for doing something. The other problem with psychological egoism is it doesn't tell us how people behave when they're conflicted. People are oftentimes enormously conflicted in the judgments that they make and the decisions that they have to make. And what do we do in those situations when they're conflicted? Right? This is the example of the lesser of two evils, or whatever, you know. What are you going to do? I would be willing to bet that if we went through here and I asked you in a political marketing sense who you're going to vote for, and I'm not going to ask anybody to tell me who they're going to vote for, I'd be willing to bet you're probably not real thrilled with any of the choices. Right? They all seem pretty bad. There are no JFKs running in this election. Whether you're Democrat or Republican, Kennedy is generally ranked as one of the great presidents. Right? There are no Lincolns running in this election. So you're going to have a choice. You're going to have to, you know, sort of hold your nose and go vote. For those of you who vote, you should vote for what you probably perceive as being the lesser of two evils, none of which may be terribly good. And so psychological egoism doesn't tell us how to deal with that. So what are the valid ethical theories? The problems with the challenges to these to philosophical ethics are that they're emotive, they're not based on reason, they're not rational, and they allow for exceptionalism. So what is a valid ethical theory? Well, then it's the opposite of these three things. It is non-emotive. It is based on rational analysis of alternatives, and it allows for no exceptionalism. Now, given the fact that there are multiple theories out there, that does not mean that there aren't problems with each of these theories. It just means that they are based on these three minimum requirements. That they're non-emotive, based on rational analysis, and allow for no exceptionalism. What does subjectivism allow? It allows you to say, I'm exceptional. I'm unique. I should be able to make up my mind. Psychological egoism, well, again, allows you to say, I can't help it. It's just me. And cultural relativism allows for people to say things like, you know, we really can't judge the Germans under Hitler as being morally culpable, because that's just their culture. They just decided that the Jews were no good and that those that had mental disabilities or physical handicaps were inferior and should all go to the gas oven. That's their culture. We just have to live with that. Well, no, like most of us would say that, no, can't do that, right? Not going to allow that to happen. So what are the valid theories? They're based on reason, not emotive, don't allow for exceptionalism. The first fully worked out theory of philosophy, which answers these three great questions: the question of knowledge, the question of conduct. So these are knowledge, conduct, governance. These are the three great questions that philosophy attempts to answer. These are obviously very relevant to marketers because we should know what it is that we're doing, right? And as I've posited, this is not as clear as it seems to be. The question of conduct, what should we be selling, what should we be marketing, is obviously relevant to us. And the question of governance is obviously relevant to us because when we do an environmental scan, legal and regulatory considerations are one of the parts of the environmental scan that we have to think about. So the first fully worked out theory of philosophy that we have that's complete in the Western intellectual tradition is Plato's Republic. And in Plato's Republic, if you want to read a work of philosophy that's easy to read, Republic is easy to read. It's written as kind of like a play. It's a dialogue. It's not like Aristotle's treatises, which are dry and dull and boring. Republic is actually, it's written, like I said, between people, between interlocutors. We know about Socrates from his most famous student, who's Plato. Socrates didn't write anything down. Perhaps the greatest mind in the Western intellectual tradition would not get tenure at a university today. I have tenure. How do you get tenure? Well, you write papers, right? You publish papers that probably nobody reads. And that's how you get tenure. Well, it's a little more complicated than that. You're evaluated on 3 criteria. You're evaluated on teaching, on research, and on service to the institution and the community. And really, the most important thing anymore seems to be publication. I don't know why. Even though they say 50% of our evaluation is on teaching, the committees have a tendency to look at research more than anything else. But in my experience, and I've sat on the tenure and promotion committee. So research seems to be important. Socrates was never the greatest mind of the Western intellectual tradition. He never got, because he never wrote anything down. He just wandered around Athens and asked pesky questions, like what is justice, right? And he goes to a party. That's how Republic starts. He begins with this question, what is justice? And he asks his interlocutors. And I asked you this question, and you came up with some ideas that Socrates talks about. Some of you talked about in your response to this. You said things like distributive justice, or the deserts theory of justice. That one's hard for Socrates to dispense with. One of the theories that one of the early interlocutors in Republic comes up with is might makes right. The will of the stronger is justice. Now, this doesn't seem right, but it's what actually happens, isn't it? You're sitting in here in this class, and you're going to do things that I ask you to do, and you don't probably like it, because I have the power. The power dynamic is such that, when I give you an exam, you can't just throw your hands up and say, you're an oppressive martinet, I'm not taking this exam, and walk out. I paid for this class, I should get my A. That's not the way things are going to work. I mean, you can do that, and things are going to turn out poorly for you. I used to say things like, you should write this down, it's a test question. And I had a student one time fold her arms, put her pencil down, roll her eyes at me, and audibly sob after I said this. And my response to that was, it matters not whether you like me, right? What matters is whether or not I like you. You liking me is irrelevant. I've had students write horrible things in my student evaluations. You're not funny. It's just not true. I'm clearly funny. Had a student write, you're a pompous ass. That's probably true. Right? But you're going to do these things because I tell you to. Because I'm in charge here at the White House. Now, Socrates is, you don't need a philosopher to tell you what's going on in the world. That's the business of somebody else. That's the business of the sociologist or the political scientist or the psychologist to tell you what's actually going on. What you need the philosopher for is to tell you what is the best that we can become. With regard to the deserts theory of justice, which some of you wrote in here, Socrates, this one's hard for Socrates to dispense with. I think it's Thrasymachus, I think, is the one that comes up with might makes right. I can't remember what came up with, giving everybody their due is what is justice. Well, what Socrates is looking for is the absolute concept of justice. And he says, is there ever a time when giving somebody what they're entitled to is not the most just? Let's suppose that you have a dangerous weapon, a shotgun. And I like to go out and shoot, trap, and skeet sporting clays. I used to be a hunter. And then I sort of realized, I have a lot of ethical issues with that, although when I was a hunter, we always ate everything that we shot. But my father and my grandfather were both big hunters, and so I grew up hunting. I watched a movie called Food Inc., and I thought about becoming a vegetarian, and that lasted until I got hungry, so it was about 4 hours. And then I went and got a hamburger. I'm gonna have to try this Impossible Burger from Burger King to see if it's the same. But I prefer to think that the cow just falls over and it ends up on my plate. I don't really want to shoot anything. I actually did go hunting last year with my father because he's 80 something, and although he's in remarkably good health, he plays golf 3 times a week and tennis 2 or 3 times a week, and he's very thin for somebody who's 80, unlike me. He doesn't eat nearly as much as I do. I realized that he's not going to be around much longer, and so we used to have a cabin in northern New Mexico. We sold it several years ago. We went up there and we went grouse hunting, and the reason I agreed to go is because A, my father has asked me to go every year, and B, because in all of the years that we've gone grouse hunting, I've never seen grouse. They're an elusive bird, so I figured this was a pretty safe bet that we were probably not going to have to see a grouse and kill it. I was correct. We didn't actually see a grouse. They're very, very odd birds. They're the only bird that, as it gets colder, they go higher in elevation, and they'll actually fly into snowbanks. They'll bury themselves. They'll fly at great velocity into snowbanks and bury themselves. So I, probably not going to see the grouse, but we went up on Elk Mountain, camped out above the tree line, and tromped around looking for grouse and never saw one grouse. So it was great for me. But let's suppose you have a shotgun and you say, well, you should try this shotgun out because it's just fantastic for doing sporting clays, which is what I now prefer to do, either skeet, trap, or sporting clay. I really like sporting clays. How many of you have shot sporting clays? It's a lot of fun. I mean, it's like a golf course for shotguns, right? They have little rabbits that run along, little clay rabbits that run along the ground, or some of the clays come at you, some go out. So it's a lot like the experience of hunting without actually having to clean anything after you're done. So you loan me your shotgun, and when I come back, you talk about how Professor Kaiser, who will be in this classroom right after me, has given you an F in advanced professional sales, and you're obviously hopped up on the cocaine. And you've been drinking along with it. You're gonna take him out because it's just unfair. Should I give you back the shotgun? That's your due. It's your property. But Socrates says no. So what he comes up with in Republic is this idea that most of us are clouded every day in our judgment and what we think we know. We did this whole thing where I asked you what this was. And he says there are people who see clearly. There are philosophers who they have in their mind's eye the ideal table. They can see things that are in the realm of the forms, and they can see the absolute concept of justice. And that's who we should get to lead us. Now, what you get from Republic, what you can tease out of it, because he says what we should do is we should form this. And the reason it answers the question of knowledge. It answers the question of knowledge. These people can see things for what they really are. Most of us are deceived by our senses every day. I can give you examples of this. I have a licensed commercial pilot. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to become a commercial airline transport pilot. That's a higher rating than I have. I rapidly realized that was not going to happen for me because I graduated high school in 1992. And I use this as an example of one of the things that we engage in functional fictions. We tell our children, you can be whatever you want to be. This is America. And that's not true. I really wanted to be an airline transport pilot, but I graduated high school in 1992. And guess what happened in 1992? Well, Bill Clinton was elected, the Cold War had ended, and the military was downsizing, and I was not going to get a pilot slot. And the way you become a commercial airline transport pilot, if you are not enormously wealthy, in which case, why would you want to become a commercial airline transport pilot? Because you don't need the job. You can just fly your own plane. The way you get to the ATP rating is you generally go into the military and you fly heavy jets. You go into the Air Force and you fly transport. Or you go into the Navy and you fly transport. And that's the way you build hours, jet hours. And that's the way when you get out, you have this rating and you have enough hours to go get the ATP. Well, that wasn't going to happen for me because we were downsizing the military. We had a very peaceful world at the time. And I was not going to get a pilot slot. The reason I use this example is because with regard to certain types of turbulence, low level, low altitude turbulence, which are caused by heating and cooling of the earth at different temperatures because of different surfaces, particularly in metropolitan areas, where you have a lot of glass or concrete that are wonderful at trapping heat and radiating it back up, that causes low altitude turbulence, right? Generally, in those summers when you get more turbulence at lower altitudes. How many of you have been on an airplane and experienced turbulence? What's the sensation that you usually get with turbulence? Is it that you are falling? Do you get a falling sensation? Anybody have that falling sensation?
I just freak out. Things really bad.
Yeah. Well, your body is being deceived. What you perceive as being is actually being thrown up at low levels, at low altitude. It's being thrown up, but the perception is your body thinks you're falling. You grab onto the chair, right? And you hold on white knuckle for your life. So the philosopher is somebody who can know what is reality in the realm of the forms. The question of conduct is answered by Socrates in his work, by Plato, in that he talks about everybody giving what they can to the republic. And then the question of governance is, well, we let this person who knows what is the truth lead us. You get the idea of the philosopher king. Now, from this, you can tease out the foundations of communism in the republic. Right? What's another valid theory? Teleological ethics is one that business students like the most. What's wrong with republic? Well, I think at the end of republic, Socrates has to admit that his ideal society is probably never going to come into existence. Right? Again, you don't have to be, you don't need a philosopher to tell you what will happen. You need the philosopher to tell you what's the best that can happen. That's where he argues, is that this is the best that can happen. What's modern ethical theory that most people like? Well, teleological or utilitarianism, this can be traced back to the first modern man. So if I asked you when the modern era begins, what would you tell me?
4,000 BC.
What?
4,000 BC.
4,000 BC. That's before Christ. That's the modern era.
No.
Oh, the modern era?
The modern era.
Industrial?
Do you think the Industrial Revolution was the modern era? That's what most students guess. I'll give you points for that.
Because that's when we started making things.
Yeah, that's what most students guess, is that that's the modern era. And that's a good guess. And there are people, historians, who would argue that that is correct, that the modern era really begins in the 20th century. But I think the vast majority of historians would say that the modern era actually begins in the Quattrocento. That's the 15th century, with the thinking of Niccolo Bernardo de Machiavelli. And what he is most famous for is a work called The Prince. This is actually not Machiavelli. He did not consider The Prince. It's the one he's most known for, but he did not consider The Prince to be his magnus opus, or opus magnus, or major work. His major work is probably the first, the discourses on the first 12 books of Titus Livy, and I think that's a better work to judge Machiavelli by. He becomes known mostly for The Prince. The Prince is a very thin book. You can read it in one sitting. every major president, or every president of the United States, with the exception of Donald Trump and George W. Bush, has read The Prince. It's not clear to me that George W. or Donald Trump have read anything. You know, say this is just fact, not making judgment, but every other president had read The Prince. What you get in The Prince is the foundation of utilitarianism. And what do I mean by that? Well, Machiavelli in The Prince doesn't come up with this specific formulation, but you can tease it out of The Prince. And the formulation is the ends justify the means. The ends justify the means. And that is the foundation. This is picked up by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill in their books on utility. So and this is the reason business students like this theory, is because it is also the foundation of capitalist thought in Adam Smith. So rather than having the greatest happiness, capitalists, starting with Smith, talk about the greatest utility, or the maximization of utility. Now, if you want to get a worthless degree, and I guess I should be careful because our current dean is an economist, but if you want to get a worthless degree that only renames things that we all understand intuitively with fancy, 25-cent terms, get a degree in economics. Economists talk about, for example, the maximization of utility. What does that mean? Well, it means what we all know intuitively, right? What is the maximization of utility? How many of you have a job? Everybody in here. That's great. You're all business students. You're not like those worthless liberal arts people who sit around, in the 420 position with their medical marijuana card, contemplating, the cosmos. You all are alert and chirpy and productive. So, what's minimum wage?
$7.25.
$7.25. Most of you, how many of you make more than $7.25? Okay, good. Almost all of you make more than $7.25. But in spite of the fact that you make, in order to make $30,000 a year, I think you have to make $15 an hour, if I did the math correctly. What's the average? What's the work year? How many hours are there in a work year?
40 times
40 times 52 comes out to what?
29. Okay.
So you have a job, you're being productive, but I'd be willing to bet that you're not a millionaire yet, although you all probably think that you will be by the time you're 30. I said the same thing. You have to stretch your money, right? You have to get you want to get the most bang for your buck. So when you buy things, you want to make sure that you're buying something that's going to last, that suits your needs and is going to stretch your, and that's the maximization of utility from an individual perspective. Now, in macroeconomic terms, what does this mean? Well, it means that in theory, in a capitalist system, we should distribute goods based on who is willing to pay the most for the good, because they will put it to the highest and best use. Now, there are problems with pure capitalism, and they come in the form of what are called market failures, where public goods become destroyed because of less than ideal conditions. And this is illustrated, and I tried to pull it up in my last class, by something called the Bunny Game. You used to be able to go online. It was the bunnygame.org, and when I typed that in, it pulled up like a particular site, and I had to rapidly shut down the computer, turn off the video, because what the Bunny Game used to be, when I used to show this, was there were two versions of the game that you could play, and I'll see if I can find it, and I'll give you a link to it. They may have taken it down, but it illustrated something called the tragedy of the commons. This is from game theory. So there were two versions of the game. The first version of the game, the bunny game, all these bunnies are out in a field, and you play against either a computer or somebody else or both. And you're told that you're a bunny merchant. You have to sell bunnies. You have to grab bunnies so that you can sell them. And at the end, there are 2 rounds to the game, the first version of the game. At the end, in order to have more bunnies for the second round, you have to have bunnies that have produced, right? What happens at the end of the first round of the game? Because the bunnies are all out in the field and you're playing against everybody else. What happens to all the bunnies at the end of the first round? Everybody can grab bunnies. So what's going to happen to the bunnies? They're what? Yeah, they're all gone. At the end of the first round, they're all gone, and there are no bunnies for the second round because either the computer, your opponent, or you have grabbed all of the bunnies, right? You have an incentive to grab as many bunnies as you can, which means there are no bunnies for the second round. In the second version of the game, version B, which also has 2 rounds, the bunnies are segregated into pens, and you're told that you have to have bunnies. So you take some bunnies from the first round, and you leave some bunnies so that you'll have some bunnies for the second round, right? This becomes a private good as opposed to a public good. And you have some bunnies left over. The tragedy of the commons illustrates what can happen. So it's based on this actual events that occurred. There used to be in lots of places, you can still see this in New York, there's a place in Central Park where Tavern on the Green is, which is a very famous restaurant which closed down for a while and is now back. They've I think, reopened Tavern on the Green. Very expensive restaurant, but it's actually on what used to be the sheep pasture. Anybody, and I asked my class this morning, any of you have sheep or goats as a child? Oh, wow, I've actually got 3 people. Nobody in my first class had. I grew up on a cattle ranch in northern New Mexico, and we had my parents bought us all kinds of animals. We had llamas, we had sheep, we had goats, we had horses, we had cattle. With regard to goats and sheep, what will they eat?
Basically anything.
Anything. They will eat anything. They will eat your clothing if they can. So you put some goats out on a lot, and what happens to the lot pretty quickly?
Disappears. All the leaves on the trees.
All the leaves on the trees. I mean, goats are great climbers, and all the grass will be gone. So this happened with the sheep commons, right? People had an incentive to put as many sheep or goats out there as they could graze, and everybody suffers because it's a public good. Your incentive is to try and get as many goats, and you degrade the environment to the point where everybody suffers. Which is why, pure capitalism doesn't necessarily work. Clean air is another example. Businesses that manufacture things like textiles, carpeting, before there were environmental regulations, these businesses produced lots and lots of waste that degrades the environment. And they had an incentive to do that because there was no regulation of it. In utilitarian ethical terms, what we're trying to get is the greatest happiness, or the maximization of happiness, not the maximization of utility, but the greatest happiness. So what utilitarians say is, look, no action is a priori right or wrong. It is only right or wrong in that it leads to overall happiness. Not my happiness, not your happiness, but overall happiness. Now this sounds okay, doesn't it? And what makes this a valid theory? Well, it's based on reason. You're going to have to analyze all the facts of the situation, and you're going to have to come up with the thing that leads to overall greatest happiness for the most people involved. So you can make this universally applicable, and it doesn't allow for any exceptionalism. You can't say, my happiness is more important than your happiness, or your happiness. It's overall happiness, right? But what are some problems with this, maybe? All ethical theories have, even though they're valid, they've got problems. What could be a problem with this? Yeah.
You can lie.
You can lie, absolutely. Utilitarians say lying is perfectly acceptable if it leads to overall greatest happiness, right? That's fine. If you lie to people and it produces overall more happiness than harm, that's okay. How many of you have seen the movie called Pretty Woman? Very old movie. Only 3 or 4 hands went up. I'm surprised. Even though it's an old movie, lots of people have seen this movie. Okay. So, Pretty Woman involves this man who falls for a prostitute, and she asks him, like, what is it that you make? And Richard Gere plays the male lead in this, and he says, I make money. One of the ways he makes money is he's an arbitrageur. There's an old saying in business that says, if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, and you'll feed him for a lifetime. Teach a man to arbitrage, and you will feed him and his family for generations to come. So what does he do? How does he arbitrage? Well, he buys companies and he breaks them up because they're worth more broken up than the whole. The parts are worth more than the whole together. Right? This seems non-intuitive, but lots of things work this way. Separated out, they're worth more than the whole thing together. And he engages in lying in this. And one of the things that he does, one of the ways he lies, is he's taking over a shipping business that this guy has. And the guy says, look, I'll buy the stock back from you. We have contracts with the Navy to build ships. And Gere says, no, you don't. I've contacted Senator so-and-so who's on the Appropriations Committee, and those contracts are down. They're nullified. And at the end of the movie, when Richard Gere has his aha moments, because Julia Roberts has convinced him that they don't produce anything, they don't make anything, that he's not really adding value, he goes and he says, your company's vulnerable, I want to help you out. And the guy says, well, what about my contracts with the Navy? How are you going to do that if they're dead? And he said, well, I was bluffing. And the guy says, well, you're very good at it. And Richard Gere says, well, that's my job. Now, if he lied in that situation and you created more wealth for his shareholders and overall the other company's shareholders, that would be an acceptable moral act, wouldn't it? If more happiness was created than pain, that would have been an acceptable act, according to an act utilitarian, right? What's the problem with that? Well, how do you judge the overall happiness in that situation? That's a very complex situation. Who's going to be unhappy with this situation? Okay, let's suppose that you increase the shareholders. So the shipping company had other shareholders. So Richard Gere was going to buy their share stock out. They were going to make a profit. His shareholders, when he broke it up, were going to make a profit. But who's going to suffer from that? The breakup of this and the dismantling of this company? Employees. Mm-hmm. And not just the employees, but who else? Their families, right? And the suppliers who supply things, the steel workers who supply, what are ships made out of anymore? They're made out of, metal, steel. You're affecting not only your shareholders, their shareholders, but you're affecting, how do you measure that? How do you measure that happiness or lack of happiness? It's almost impossible. If we have very simplistic situations, we can ascertain what the overall greatest happiness is. When you were a little kid, I think I was talking about this last time, vaccinations, right? I got vaccinated, and I was a hyper little kid. At the time, they didn't have diagnoses for ADD, but I probably would have been diagnosed as ADD. I was bouncing off the walls constantly.
Wow.
Right? They said shot, and it took the doctor, the nurse, and my mother to catch me and hold me down. And the doctor assured me that those shots were not going to hurt. And that was a lot. Yeah. Right? And they tell them this won't hurt. The hell it won't. Right? But it's for your own good. And it's not just for your own good, it's for the good, so that you're not infecting other people. We have eliminated, in some cases, eradicated diseases. Now, some of them are coming back as a result of this anti-vaccination movement. But we've eliminated a lot of diseases that used to take a lot of people's lives. And every doctor probably lied to the little kid when they're giving him these shots. This won't hurt bit. You won't feel a thing, right? And that's a lie. But in that situation, it's very easy to determine what the greatest happiness is. In this other situation with Richard Gere, and how do you determine what's the greatest happiness? His shareholders are happy. Probably the shareholders of the shipping company that are getting bought out and now they can go reinvest that money in something else are probably going to be happy. But all those families are not going to be happy. And all of those people that supply that business are not going to be happy. How do you measure that? That becomes really, really difficult. Another problem with act utilitarianism, so utilitarianism takes two forms, act and rule. Another problem with utilitarianism is that there are just some things, so act and rule, there are just some things that we say you shouldn't, even if it creates more happiness, you shouldn't do. So last time, I think we watched a video on how ethical is the chocolate in your Easter basket, right? We watched that on Edocracy.
Yeah.
A very small percentage of the population is enslaved to produce chocolate. And aren't we all so much better off? There are lots of benefits to chocolate, it turns out. One of the things that's a benefit to eating chocolate is that you just feel good. It's a reward. And that contributes to overall good mental health. One of the things that we know, so there's this guy who wants to ban sugar. Not ban it, he wants to tax it so that we're not eating so much sugar. I guess he got this idea, this economist, he got this idea from Michael Bloomberg. Michael Bloomberg was mayor of New York, he's now running for president. One of the things that he decided he was going to do was he was going to outlaw in New York City big gulps. Right? Gonna get rid of the big gulp because people are just too fat. And one of the reasons that perhaps we're overweight is because people go to the 7-Eleven. Is that who has big gulp? Is it 7-Eleven?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. And they get this big gulp that's nothing but it's enormously calorically dense. Sugar is enormously, I mean, you're consuming a 12-ounce can of soda, Coca-Cola, has what, 120 calories?
Yeah.
And what's a big gulp? How many ounces? So you 12 ounces, what's it?
32, 40 ounce
32 ounces?
but there's a bigger one too.
There's a bigger one.
It is 40 ounce.
So 2 point something or other for the 32 ounce, you're getting 2.7 something or other times the sugar in that big gulp is a can. I mean, how many calories a day should you consume if you want to maintain your BMI at its current level?
It's about 1,200.
Huh? Yeah, 1,800 to 2,000 calories a day is about right? 2,000 calories or less. How many are you consume? Well, now you've consumed this big gulp, and you know at 2.7 times 120, that's a lot of calories right there, and you haven't even eaten anything yet, right? So Michael Bloomberg was going to outlaw the big gulp. They decided he couldn't do that.
Cook away.
Right? Can't outlaw the big gulp. But this economist wants to nudge people. We're not going to outlaw the big gulp. We're going to nudge people into doing what we want them to do. How are we going to do that? We're going to tax it. And this works. We've seen this. They've done this with cigarettes, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I was a kid growing up, I remember my parents are rabid anti-smokers. I mean, but I had friends whose parents smoked, and I had an aunt who smoked, and they used to send us, you could do this when I was growing up as a kid. You could send your kids to the store to buy cigarettes for you.
Oh.
You send them to the store, some of the stores, if they were somewhat ethically sensitive, would require that you had a note from your mom or dad that said, little Johnny is buying cigarettes for me. And cigarettes were 75 cents a pack. Now that was back in the 80s, and 75 cents was a little bit, I mean, it wasn't as cheap as it is today, but they were 75 cents a pack. And I remember when they raised the price to $1, and everybody just thought, oh my God, I'm gonna have to quit smoking. It's a whole $1 for a pack of cigarettes. Well, we've decided we don't like smoking. And so we've nudged people into, we don't say it's illegal, but we've nudged people into quitting.
Yeah.
We have the lowest percentage of smokers now that we've ever, although it's starting to rise again as a result of these flavored vaping and things like that, these nicotine products. And it's rising, by the way, it's declining among all age groups except yours.
Wow.
It's now increasing. But how much is a pack of cigarettes now?
Like $8.
Depending
on what you
I don't know. I never opened a cigarette.
5 to 7,
get. 7 to 8 bucks.
$7 to $8.
Yeah. If you get a very good spirit, it's like $10.
If you go to the Indian smoke shop, it's a little bit less, right? They're expensive, and we've cut down on the number of smokers, and isn't that great? We're nudging people into doing what we want them to do. Well, again, how do you measure overall happiness? Harvard did a study that shows that encouraging people to smoke is actually economically beneficial, because although smokers have a high cost in terms of cancer and lung and heart disease, that cost is very short. They get these diseases and they die very early, as opposed to non-smokers like my parents. My father has been retired. The FBI had a mandatory retirement age of 55. He's 86. When he retired from the FBI, you got 75% of your base salary for life. And you get cost of living adjustments with that. So my father has been drawing Social Security and his FBI retirement from 55 to 86.
Wow.
Why did they come up with 65 as the retirement age for Social Security? Well, because at the time they came up with that age, most people died, what?
Around that
Before
age.
65. The life expectancy. So Harvard did the study, we could make Social Security actuarially sound if we would start giving everybody cigarettes in the 3rd grade.
Wow.
Right? They'd have a lot of healthcare costs, maybe at 20, but they would die. And wouldn't that be better off overall economically for all? I mean, how do you evaluate these situations? In order to deal with this problem, rule utilitarian is the second form of utilitarianism that comes up. And the rule utilitarian attempts to deal with this problem by saying, look, we're going to come up with rules that in the aggregate, maybe not in the specific instance, create the greatest happiness, but in the aggregate, by and large, on the whole, these things will promote overall greatest happiness. We'll follow the rules, and the rules will lead to overall greatest happiness. What's an example of this? That's a business example. Let's suppose that you are the manufacturer of a drug that is going to, that will cure the coronavirus. By the way, how many people are actually dying, and what percentage of people who are infected with coronavirus are actually dying? What's the percentage? No, much lower than that. The actual death toll among people who get, so we made a huge fuss over this. The actual death toll is about 3% of people who are infected. So you're all terrified of the coronavirus, and should we be? It has a slightly higher death toll than the flu. Right? I mean, the flu is very deadly, but not quite as deadly as the coronavirus. But it's only about 3%. Well, let's suppose it's more deadly than that. Let's suppose that the coronavirus has a 60% mortality rate. That's more than half. That's a lot of people, right? Right? Sort of like the mortality rate of HIV in the early days. I remember the first cases of HIV. They didn't actually call it HIV or AIDS then. They called it GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. Let's suppose that you have a drug that cures the coronavirus. It's this very deadly disease. It's 60%, no, it's not. We're going to pretend for the hypothetical that it is. But it's very difficult to manufacture. It is the product of a rare plant that's found above the tree lines in Colorado, some kind of thistle seed. And, there are these mountain goats in Colorado. By the way, they've reintroduced more goats because we love goats to Colorado and to Wyoming. And there are problems with these goats. They're now creating an environmental hazard. So you gotta get the seed. It's hard to come by. It takes a long time to grow. So there's a very limited number. Right now you have, let's say, 4 doses of the drug. And shucks, you're one of the people that's infected with coronavirus. So you're infected, I'm infected, Donald Trump is infected, Mother Teresa is infected, and some homeless guy named Bob. How are you going to determine who gets the drug?
Who's more important?
Well, yeah, using an act utilitarian principle, we're going to decide who's more important, whose life is more valuable, right? So who are we not going to give the drug to? Well, Mother Teresa will say, I'll take one for the team. I'll skip getting the drug. Well, no, you can't. No. The woman is a saint. These people don't come along every day. You're going to need them. Well, let's not give it to Donald Trump. Well, he is the leader of the free world, right? He's an important guy. Well, you turn to me, you're a lawyer. And we've all heard the jokes, right? What do you call 1,000 lawyers at the bottom of the ocean? A good start. What's the difference between a dead skunk on the side of the road and a dead lawyer on the side of the road? There are skid marks in front of the skunk. Well, you see what we're doing here? We're putting a value on a human life, and that's just creepy. So rule utilitarianism attempts to fix this problem by saying, look, we'll establish rules that in the aggregate will produce the greatest happiness. So what kind of rule can we establish? Well, first come, first serve, right? That treats everybody fair. You're the first one in the door. We have 4 doses. You're the last one in. Sorry, Bob, not going to be you. And in the aggregate, this kind of rule, this application of the rule, will probably produce the greatest because it ensures that we're not doing this calculation on human lives. And people will feel like they're being treated fairly. So that's the attempt to fix it. All right, so the problem, I will end with this. The problem with the rule utilitarian is can you develop a rule that covers every single situation? No, you can't, all right? We'll talk about duty ethics next time and virtue ethics. And I guess we're not going to have the exam on Tuesday because I still haven't gotten through this.